Hello, thank you for this invitation to address the conference on basic income in Asia Pacific in Taiwan. I'm Geoff Crocker, living in the UK and working on the economics of basic income. There are traditionally, I would suggest, three strong reasons for basic income. The first is social justice, well explained by people like Guy Standing in his books on the precariat. The second is to do with administrative efficiency, i.e. that if you're going to have any welfare system at all, that basic income is the most cost-effective to operate. That argument is well covered by writers like Malcolm Torrey. And the third is the argument from technology, the fundamental economics of basic income, which is what I'll be covering in this presentation. The arguments against basic income traditionally are that it's seen to be a work disincentive, and secondly, that it's economically unaffordable. The worry that basic income would be a disincentive to work is counteracted by the argument that the current welfare systems themselves are a much larger disincentive to work, because typically today, if someone on benefit finds a job, then they lose all of their benefit, and the marginal rate of tax, as it were, can be as high as 90%. On the question of affordability, it is true that a substantial basic income would cost each economy substantially, but the counter-argument to that is that affordability is defined by output GDP. It's defined by what the economy can produce. It is not defined by how much money the government has in its exchequer, and I will amplify that argument in the presentation. So moving on to the arguments from technology. In their book, The Second Machine Age, Brynjolfsson and McAfee paint a picture of huge automation where we're going to see huge increases in unemployment, we're going to see social exclusion, low economic demand as a result, recession, unsustainable levels of consumer credit to try to prop up demand, leading to economic crisis, and then the application of austerity policy. Basic income breaks this vicious circle. The question is, how do we fund such a substantial basic income? Let me offer you a thought experiment of a totally automated economy. In this totally automated economy, a machine is plugged into the earth, and without any labour, it produces all the goods and services that we need in the economy. How do we then distribute those goods and services? They can only be distributed by the government giving out vouchers to all of the population. The population then exchanges their vouchers for goods and services. The government takes the vouchers back in, destroys them for that year, and issues a new set of vouchers in the following year. Now, in this thought experiment, there are two very important implications. First of all, 100% of GDP becomes basic income, and secondly, perhaps more radically, 100% of GDP also becomes financial deficit. Now this of course is an extreme because it's a thought experiment, but my argument from that is a more nuanced argument. That is that in high technology economies, first of all, an element of basic income is essential to maintain consumer demand, and secondly, that financial deficit to some degree is an inevitability. Now, we also then need to add to that a heterodox view of economics. In this heterodox view of economics, first of all, it's recognized that all economic entities of consumption, of investment, of consumer spend, and so on, are all rendered affordable by output GDP, not by the amount of money that the government has in its exchequer. Secondly, that money has no inherent value. It doesn't derive that value from gold reserves, it doesn't derive value from the sale of government debt, it acquires value only from output GDP. And thirdly, that a sovereign state can create money without reference to gold reserves or the sale of government bonds or the creation of debt. It can create money solely in reference to the same output GDP. So, let's look at the nature of income in the economy. Let's take a look at this graph. This graph is very significant for the argument for basic income. It's a graph of the UK economy from the year 1948 right through to 2016, i.e. virtually 70 years of economic history. And it maps consumer expenditure against consumer income. And you can see very simply from that graph, in 1948, consumer income was in excess of consumer expenditure. In other words, people earned enough for their expenditure. In 1995, that changed such that subsequent to 1995, in the years to the present day 2018, consumer expenditure has been in excess of consumer income. And the change is long-term, it's inexorable, it's undeniable. It's a big structural change in the economy. This demonstrates that a significant element of unearned income is needed in the modern high-technology economy. This slide summarizes the points about the nature of money in the economy. I remember being an economics student at university 40 years ago, and my lecturer saying, "Oh dear," he said, "nobody understands money." And actually I think that's still true today. Nobody understands money. What is the nature of money? Well, the financial orthodoxy has the following view of money, i.e. that money has inherent value only from either gold reserves or from the sale of government bonds which create debt. Secondly, that money is real and cannot be created or destroyed. And thirdly, that government budgets must balance. The challenging heterodox view of money is, on the contrary, that money has no inherent value but only derives its value from output GDP, that a sovereign state can issue money versus that output GDP without the need for creating debt, and finally, that financial deficit is inevitable and manageable in high technology economies. Let's try to show that comparison graphically. In the first part of the graph, we see the monetarist theory of money, where on the left-hand side, it's either gold reserves or the creation of government debt that is creating value for money, and that's then making investment, production, wages, welfare and consumption affordable or not. But in the graph below, we show the radical neo-Keynesian heterodox theory of money, which is that it's actually activity, it's economic activity of investment and production producing output GDP, which then creates value in money, driving wages, welfare, consumption, and the economic circle. So output GDP becomes the proper test of affordability and not the amount of money that a government has in its exchequer. Basic income proposals, in my view, should therefore adopt a neo-Keynesian theory of money, and basic income proposals must accept that there is an inevitable deficit in high technology economies, which in turn can then fund a substantial basic income. So much for the theoretical claim. So now let's look at empirical fact, which might test that theoretical claim. This first graph shows the deficit in the UK economy over the last 23 years. And as you can see at a glance, for the majority of those 23 years, the UK economy has operated at a deficit. There's only 2 years, in fact, when it didn't run a deficit. And remember, this is despite the frequent attempt by Chancellors of the Exchequer in the UK to eradicate deficit. They failed to do so. It's beginning to look as though it's inevitable. The next graph shows a similar picture for the G7 economies, and again you'll see that for all of those G7 economies, for the majority of the many recent years, they have also operated at a deficit. So deficit is empirical fact as well as theoretical prediction. The third graph shows the level of debt that has been accumulated in each of those economies over the last many years. And as you'll see from this picture in 2016, most of those economies have debts in excess of their annual GDP. So for the G7 economies, with the exception of Germany, all the other 6 of the G7 economies have a national debt which is more than 100% of their GDP. And in the extreme case of the Japanese economy, and this, remember, of course, is an Asia-Pacific conference, the Japanese economy has a national debt which is equal to 234% of its GDP. Now, when you look at facts like that, it makes you think that perhaps the theoretical claim is correct, that deficit is inevitable because no one seems to be able to overcome it. But secondly, that debt accumulates without having any big impact on the economy. The idea that this debt is somehow some mountainous burden that is going to be heaped on the shoulders of our grandchildren is simply incorrect. There is no way in which an economy is going to be able to pay back 234% of its GDP. This has to be written off. It is, in fact, virtually being written off anyway, so it's better to face that in explicit policy terms, that deficit is inevitable and can be written off without harm. This is a perfectly manageable proposal and, in fact, an inevitable policy, given the argument we made earlier for the impact of technology in the economy requiring a basic income funded by perpetual deficit. So in conclusion, the theory predicts that in high technology economies we'll see a need for unearned income and therefore for basic income as an essential component of demand. And the theory also predicts that we will see the inevitability of financial deficit. When we turn, as we just have, to empirical fact, we see that those theoretical implications are borne out in practice. The fact is that in high technology economies, basic income is an essential component of demand, financial deficit is inevitable, basic income at a substantial level can therefore be funded by perpetual deficit. Thank you for your attention and all best wishes to the conference in Taiwan.